wanted to note this latest Apple controversy. So I'll read this tweet from Tim Sweeney on February 26th. He said, Apple leadership faces some massive decisions in the coming weeks as the contradictions between their stated principles and the intended and actual consequences of their present policies are reckoned with. The App Store monopoly, the digital goods payments monopoly, the tax, the suppression of true information about competing purchasing options, the blocking of competing web browser engines, and outright destruction of web apps. It doesn't have to be this way. Apple is a few bold and visionary decisions away from being the company they once were and that they still advertise themselves to be. Beloved brand to consumers, partner to developers, and overlord to none. And then I'll read a tweet from Paul Graham on Wednesday. Apple just terminated Epic's developer account, and they admitted that this tweet, the tweet from Tim Sweeney that I just read, was one of the reasons. We don't want to think about Apple being evil. It would be so inconvenient. We don't want to switch to Android, but I see ever more signs that power has corrupted them. Ben, do you have any thoughts on what's happening here?
Well, I think Paul Graham was in the chorus complaining about Gemini, so I have bad news for him about his smartphone takes and complaining about companies. Yeah. All right. Number one, astronomically stupid decision by Apple on multiple respects. So first off, Epic was handing Apple a win in that Apple got to look like the gracious sort of winner. We're letting them back on to do the App Store.
By the rules, yeah.
Epic was going to launch a store in Europe. It was going to fail because Apple has set it up to fail. And also, I just think the alternative App Store is not going to be a winner for all the technical constraints and user experience constraints that's going to go into it. So not only would Apple get to look gracious in the moment, but in the long run, then they get a point to it and say, hey, look, our biggest hater, who is the most motivated to succeed, who has an app store on PCs, didn't work because phones are different. Look, we are doing this for the benefit of users. It makes it so much easier, so much simpler. They were going to, they handed Apple this opportunity to be a sacrificial lamb on a platter. And it looked like Apple was going to accept it, and now they threw it away. So just tactically dumb. Number two, they put in writing to Epic that they are removing their license because of what Tim Sweeney wrote on Twitter.
It's so stupid. I cannot believe they did that. Okay, continue.
Yeah, I can't believe they did it either, right? Like, I mean, one of the things about their whole App Store thing is they're notorious about not wanting to email developers ever. They want to get on a phone call, right? Why do you want to get on a phone call? Because you want to convey information that you don't want to be publicly available, right?
Yep.
Might have been a good idea here. I mean, like it's in black and white. You say something that we don't like, you are going to get punished. Now, to be super duper clear, Epic flagrantly violated the developer agreement. Apple and the court ruled, and appropriately so, that Apple had the right to revoke the developer agreement. So just to be clear, we're not saying that it's like what we were just talking about. Legally speaking, or contractually speaking, Apple's 100% in their rights here.
Well,
but,
wait. Be even clear. How exactly did Apple violate the developer agreement?
No, Epic. So, because Epic,
excuse me,
the precursor to them filing this lawsuit is they shipped a version of Fortnite where they could remotely turn on internal purchases so you could buy stuff on Fortnite. And they did this to get kicked from the App Store. I don't know if they wanted to establish standing or they wanted to sort of just like make a big brouhaha about it. But that was flagrantly against the developer agreement to go in and remotely turn on. You're not supposed to turn on remote features generally. You're definitely not supposed to have your own in-app purchase that's separate. They flagrantly broke the rules. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And based on that, according to the developer agreement, Apple absolutely has the right to kick them out of the App Store permanently. And Apple did so. And that's part of why Apple looks so gracious in letting them back in, because Apple didn't have to do that. And so to be clear, legally speaking, Apple's not bound by the First Amendment. And, they can say, we don't like what you're saying, so you're kicked out. They have the right to do that. It's just astronomically stupid.
Right.
And
Apple's not bound by the First Amendment, but the reason honestly, I was shocked by how short-sighted the behavior was, just because, I almost wonder whether it was a decision that wasn't cleared by some kind of central leadership team, because it just seems like such a
no way. This is definitely at the highest levels.
Well, that's even worse. I mean,
here's the answer to that. Here's the answer to that. So, not to psychoanalyze Apple, which means I'm about to psychoanalyze Apple.
Here we go.
So I've had this take for a while that, Apple has this sort of, there's a sort of like cognitive dissonance about the App Store, in that they vaguely know it's kind of dirty, it's kind of nasty. It's not like, they can do it, but like we really, developers really did help make our platform. We would definitely still have an SDK if we could make money off it. But they got in court against Epic, and Tim Cook had to go on the stand, and he had to make the case that we developed this IP and we have a right to collect a commission for it. And that was the correct legal argument to make, right? Like
sure.
We've talked about this in the context of potential antitrust lawsuits or whatever it might be. They have no duty to deal, to use sort of a legal term. And all that is correct. They are legally justified in collecting the App Store commission for the reasons that we've sort of talked about. At the same time, though, I think that there's a discomfort there, right? It's like we would have this SDK, like I just said, developers did help Apple. They did make the iPhone attractive. They would have made an SDK sort of regardless. And so there's this cognitive dissonance. And what happens when you have cognitive dissonance? It's uncomfortable. You want to solve it. You want to sort of like get rid of it. And my sort of psychoanalysis of Apple is the way they got rid of that was to actually get rid of that as a discomfort by completely and utterly, from top to bottom, buying into their legal argument and making that their internalized moral argument.
Yeah.
Developers owe us. They succeed because of us. And you saw this, the key thing here was that Spotify press release. When the EU decision came down, Apple releases this press release, and it's just vicious. It's like, they have a free app. They have the most users in the EU, and they have the gall to want more. The entitlement is disgusting. We made this. We did this. We did XYZ. They owe us. We get to collect it. And it's incredible. The tone of that press release is so strident. And right. It took that legal argument, which at the time, it's like, I bet Apple wishes they didn't have to say this publicly because it looks really bad, even though it's a very strong legal argument. Now they're out there trumpeting from the rooftops. They have fully internalized it. They believe developers owe them. And if anything, they don't collect enough. And if that is the mindset, which I think that Spotify press release shows is fully internalized, because again, they're not saying it's a court of law. They're putting in a press release.
Well, I watched Daniel Ek respond to that decision, and he was not responding with fire and brimstone the way Apple was. And I thought his delivery was actually far more effective, because he sat in front of a camera doing a selfie video for like 6 minutes, explaining that Spotify won, and then explaining that it's probably not going to matter because Apple is not going to comply, or will comply in the most unhelpful way possible, won't abide by the spirit of the decision, and this is a fight that's going to continue. And from a PR perspective, it was a shrug of the shoulders that left me irate at Apple. Granted, I came to the video with my own pre-existing biases, but is the sort of thing that is ultimately going to sway people over time. And that's what Apple needs to be worried about from a business perspective. So there's like, from a legal perspective, they're on solid grounds. They have their principles. That's their right. We've talked about all of it. They can choose to ride out the App Store fights and die on this hill until the bitter end. But I would just say that there, but for the grace of tolerant regulators, goes Apple in this regard. And so picking needless fights like this in public just puts a giant target on their back.
Well, that's how we get to this Epic decision, right? we look at like, it's shocking. Why would you, this is such a PR disaster. You had an easy win. And not just that, I actually think tactically it would help you because you want Epic to launch a store and for it to fail. Like that helps
Right.
you sort of big picture.
Warning
But
others.
if I'm right, again, with the caveat that I am a business analyst who's like doing psychoanalysis of like Apple's leadership, if I'm right, and this sort of, they've solved their cognitive dissonance by completely closing themselves off and locking in on this view that developers owe us. They're so lucky we let them and only take 30%.
Mhm.
In that view, this action makes total sense, right? If you've convinced yourself of your own righteousness, you start doing stuff that everyone on the outside is like, can you chill? But to you, your internal calculus sort of makes sense. I mean, you could tie this back to what we were talking about earlier in the episode, why I get nervous when there aren't sort of business sort of constraints, because you can convince yourself of righteousness. And Apple, I don't know how you can escape the conclusion that they have utterly and completely convinced themselves of the righteousness of their position, not just the legal correctness of their position, not just the profitability of their decision, but the righteousness of their decision. And when you're in that state, you kind of adopt this sort of fundamentalist sort of view of the world, and you start producing a press release like this Spotify one. You start making decisions like, you made a tweet we don't like, you're out. And it's internally consistent, and everyone on the outside is, have you lost your mind? Right. And the answer is, yeah. That's the fundamentalist mindset is a sense of losing your mind.
Right. Well, and righteousness was sort of foundational to Apple's identity. But when we were talking about the App Store policies like a month or two back, we had a number of emailers write in and say, Apple started with the 1984 commercial where they're taking it to Big Brother. Apple is now clearly Big Brother. And behavior like this really doesn't help fight that allegation. And it just is bizarre. But your theory is the best explanation I've heard in terms of what's going on there. Is there's just sort of a mass psychosis that's taken hold and explains a lot of the PR missteps, if not legal missteps.
Right. And here's the thing, the one thing I would push back on your comment a few minutes ago is Apple might not be risking anything, right? Like I think the EU, the EU kind of makes up like this whole thing, like the fine's 1.8 billion euros because we decided the original fine wasn't big enough, right? It's like, and what's the reasoning for our case? Oh, here's a press release that doesn't say anything, XYZ, right? Like who knows what they will do. In the US, I think Apple's position is pretty strong legally. I actually do think Spotify is the weakest part of Apple's position. In that app, it's not because
Apple Music, yeah.
Apple Music, yeah. This is the weirdest thing with the EU's press release. And by the way, this makes me sympathetic to Apple. The press release doesn't even mention Apple Music. The whole reason this is objectionable is Apple is levering their control of the App Store into an attempt to take over music. With the Apple Music,
right,
either has a better UX because it's purchased in the app and Spotify doesn't, or it has a huge cost advantage because Spotify's pay 30% and Apple Music 30%. Doesn't, right? Yeah. So like to me, just like there's a fundamental unfairness in this, setting aside the sort of legal issues. I think this is in US law. Potentially tying cases are very hard to win, particularly these days, but this seems a pretty blatant sort of like example of problematic tying. But Apple very well could keep getting away with this. And the iPhone is dominant. Most consumers don't care about this, and they will keep making money on that forever. But this is where you get back to the Vision Pro. Like a new platform, you need developers to make it attractive, to make it compelling. Why, as a developer, do you want to invest in this? Maybe Apple's calculation is, look, someone's going to do it. There's lots of developers out there, and I'm glad that 90% of you are mad and pissed off. The other 10% are going to come in and make great apps, and you're going to be sad you weren't there. And maybe they'll be right. They might be right. And I am just wary, I would say, after the last 5 to 7 years, I did a lot of Apple's making a big mistake because think of what might happen, and nothing has happened. And I think that's worth noting and acknowledging. But will the bill come due at some point? In 5 years? Maybe not. 10 years? 20 years? Like,